Since before recorded history, the people of Britain have had first-hand experience of the strange and unusual. Spirits who haunt ancient castles, stories of werewolves and banshees roaming the countryside, and fantastic creatures like gnomes, fairies and pixies, all firmly embedded in our native folklore. This cultural experience makes us uniquely qualified to research these types of phenomena and help us find the truth of the reality that surrounds us. So sit back and relax as your hosts, Irene Allen Block and Mark Johnson, take you on a journey through this strange realm and together help us find the answers to the mysteries that lie just beyond our grasp. Welcome to Paranormal UK Radio.
And good evening, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Paranormal UK Radio, the flagship show here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm Mark Johnson, and I'm sitting in tonight as host for Irene Allen Block. She apologizes for not being here tonight, had a slight emergency with one of her dogs, had to have emergency surgery, so she's tied up with that, taking care of him. She sends her apologies to all of our listeners, but you know what? We have our great co-host who sits in with us. Andy Mercer is here tonight. Andy, welcome. Thank you for joining us again tonight.
No problem at all. It's always great to be here with you. Really do enjoy doing these shows when I get the opportunity. Slightly sad circumstances today, of course, and I hope obviously Irene's dog's going to be okay. But yes, I love to be here with you guys. It's great fun. Definitely.
Yeah, and that's the thing. We have our four-legged kids, as I call them, and I've lost more than my share over the years, and you got to take care of them, you got to baby them, and when there's something wrong with them, one of the things when she comes back, we're going to mention for those people who do have dogs, especially larger dogs, there's a little, at least it's little known to me, and I've had dogs all my life, condition called bloat that can hit a dog and hit them suddenly, and if you don't take care of it within an hour, they will die. For whatever reason, the insides get this gas and it twists up the innards. And she just happened to notice her dog had an extended belly and remember reading about it, got him in the doctor and got him in time, because any longer than that, they start getting necrosis in the stomach and they will die. And it's an emergency surgery. So it's shocking. But, it's something all of us dog lovers and all of us who have pets out there, that's something to keep in mind. Do some research on it. It's a scary thing, but if you're on top of it, you have a good chance of saving your pet.
Absolutely, yes. Definitely get that word out about that. I keep guinea pigs, I have to confess. I have a couple of small guinea pigs, which they don't tend to last very long, so you kind of get used to losing them, but it's always a shock when any animal is in any kind of distress. So,
I know.
My sympathies.
I've become such an animal lover. The older I get, the more I love them. And, I don't like seeing any animal in pain, or I'd adopt 10 dogs right now if I had the choice, because so many dogs that need and cats that need adoption, need homes. That's my cause, if people, if you can adopt a dog that's at a shelter, do it. You get a lifelong friend.
Oh, absolutely. I grew up with a dog myself, so I know exactly what you mean, definitely.
And here in the U.S., what weird stuff's going on here in the U.S. With 2 hurricanes and a third on the way. Florida getting clobbered by Irma, bitch. Well, not as bad as they had feared, but I don't know if you saw these pictures, Andy. I've never seen this phenomenon in my life where the ocean disappears. Have you seen that? In Miami and Tampa, the bays there emptied of water completely.
That's incredible.
People walked out a mile out to where the ocean is supposed to be, and there's no water. The power of these storms is so great that it's literally sucking the ocean out away from the shore.
That is incredible. And I've seen some images of what's been going on over there. Of course, the Caribbean is another area that's hit very badly. I mean, I'm a massive fan of cricket, so one of the teams we play at the moment is the West Indies, and of course the team's over here, and of course they've got friends and family in the eye of the storm, so they've obviously been very concerned, and they actually wore some black armbands for the last match. Wow. To commiserate for those who've actually passed away during the storm. So yeah, it's something that I've been following closely as well.
Terrible terrible. I mean, weather. This is the last couple of years. Weather's been bad. Whether you're on the global warming side or climate change side, I believe in climate change. I mean, things are going weird. So, yeah, it's something we've got to be prepared for.
Absolutely. It's one of the things that was said on the radio earlier on today, that one of the reasons why this storm is so specifically so bad is because the ambient temperature of the sea has risen just slightly, but it's sufficient that it requires less energy to create this level of storm than it would have done with a colder ocean. So it is a real example of there's been a definite global change. We can obviously discuss why that's happened, but the evidence seems to be there is a definite change in the climate. So that's really quite worrying that these sorts of massive level 5 storms could become more common than they are now, which is really rather worrying.
Yeah, kind of makes me glad I live inland, in the middle of the country. Of course, now my problem where I live is just north of me is the Yellowstone caldera, and if the supervolcano, and if that ever blows, yeah, I'll be busy at that time. I'll be busy evaporating in the upper atmosphere.
Absolutely. Well, fortunately, myself and Steph are both lucky living in the UK. We don't tend to get that often, particularly unusual weather patterns, though. Actually, we had a torrential downpour here today, which was probably one of the heaviest storms I've seen in quite a while. And that's unusual for around here. So we're a little more fortunate. It tends to be more stable weather-wise in our area of the world. So.
Well, that's good. But you know what? Hey, speaking of unusual, let's get right in with our guest tonight, who has a lot of unusual stories to share with us. We've had her on the show before, about a year or so ago. We're very thrilled to invite her back on. She has written several books. In fact, I think it's getting beyond several now. Most of them focused on people going missing. And her two newest books that have come out in the last few months, Horror in the Woods and Terror in the Woods, The Missing. So we want to welcome Steph Young to the program. How are you tonight, Steph?
Hello, I'm great, thank you. Thank you for having me back on.
Well, thank you for coming on. And, I'm always really intrigued. I've read so many of your books. And the idea of so many people in the U.S. going missing, and not just in the U.S., it's around the world. I know you focus a lot on the U.S. and in Europe too, that people go missing under very strange circumstances. Just to recap a little bit for our listeners, can you tell us just how you got interested in this subject and how you went about researching it?
Well, first of all, I was trying to write a book about time travel, and when I was doing that research, I was coming across places, mostly in forests worldwide, that seemed to have perhaps alternate dimensions, or people were going into them and they were experiencing lost time. So I started moving from simply different dimensions or time slips to, was something else going on? And then began to collect other cases where perhaps they could have been taken, could have been an alien abduction, or perhaps there were other paranormal things going on as well, because it seemed to be that once I started looking, you could find a conglomeration of lots of different factors. So people might have really strange sightings of creatures they couldn't identify, or there could have been evidence of some other worldly thing taking them, and it just kind of developed from there. And I suppose more recently I've kind of really looking especially for those cases that are just so baffling and maybe have really strange clues left behind. So that's kind of how I started, and it's just become an addiction, really.
I bet. Well, I could tell you right now that you've already picked my interest when you talk about time travel, these alternate dimensions. That's right up my alley. It's something I'm really fascinated in. Andy, are you there?
I am, yes. Sorry, I just accidentally hit my microphone.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I asked because things were kind of wonky here on Skype. I'm going to fix this a little bit later, but
it's that storm, I think.
Could be. Alternate dimensions, time travel, time loops, time slips. That all seems to play an importance in this. So, with your new book, how many books are you up to now?
Probably about 8 or 9.
Wow.
Yeah, I do a lot of hours every day.
Mm-hmm. Don't blame you there. I mean, it is a fascinating subject.
Yeah, it's just so intriguing. Although I've just done a different show, and that was on the cases of particularly the young college-age men going missing. And that has been an absolute addiction for me as well for many years. But that's very much a human element in sort of remote places, sometimes in cities, sometimes remote places. So again, there's another element, but it doesn't really tie in with the forests, but it's very much people going missing.
Well, let's get into the forest and the stranger stuff here in a moment. You just piqued my interest because college-age men going missing. Now, I understand college-age women going missing with human trafficking that goes on. That's still bad in this world. People who say there's no slavery in this world are absolutely wrong. And I'm a big advocate for the destruction of human trafficking, the sex trade. And so many young women get lured in or kidnapped and put into this trade, both in the U.S. and Europe and everywhere. But I'm intrigued if you could talk a little bit about college-age men and what some of the reasons are that they are going disappearing.
Gosh, it's a very complex set of circumstances. I'll try and sum it up. It started in New York 20 years ago, and I was not the first to come across these. I have a very, very good contact who's a federal agent, but it was actually discovered first of all by a New York detective, and they had picked up on these cases, but at the same time in the Midwest, a Emmy-winning journalist called Christy Peel had actually picked up on it too. And these two detectives and Christy Peel had come together. Now, initially it began in New York. So there was a case of a young man called Patrick McNeil in 97. He had been in a bar with friends, and he left them saying that he was going to go home and get the subway back to Fordham University, and he was going to go back with a girlfriend. She went into the bathroom, and by the time she came out, he had gone from outside the bar. Well, it later seemed to be that a car had been in the vicinity, and when he was outside, he became very unwell, and he was leaning over to be sick and stumbling and falling into cars. When he righted himself and started to walk off again, the car moved on. So the car was stopping and starting with him. He had also been vomiting in the bathroom. This came out later, but his friends said that he definitely wasn't drunk. So it seemed to be possibly that he had been drugged. Well, he was found in the river 40 days later. I believe it was 12 miles downstream, and it was ruled that he had died of drowning. And in fact, I've spoken to the supervising detective who was around at the time, and he said, because I was taking this to him saying, you know, what's in this? And he said, no, he took some drugs and threw himself in, killed himself. Well, Detective Gannon, who came up with these cases, said that's I don't think it is that. So he hired a renowned pathologist called Cyril Wecht, who looked into the autopsy, and what they say is that he had indoor larvae that had settled on him. Now, it was winter at the time, so it couldn't have been that the larvae settled on him outside in the cold. It was an indoor fly, so it laid eggs on the body. The body was dead, so he was indoors, he'd been killed indoors, and then found 40 days later in the river. But he also had binding marks around his neck, and so that was the first case. The second one, the supervising detective said to me, look at a boy called Larry Andrews. Well, he disappeared on New Year's Eve. He'd gone into New York City, and he was with friends, and he just vanished out on the street as they were walking, more or less. And he was found in the river in a location called Owl Head, a water pollution plant. Well, not long after that, another boy called Josh Stossak disappeared. He was in a bar in the same area, and he went outside because he was going to go back to his car and go home. His dad said that he liked to drink Guinness, but he wasn't drunk. His friend said he wasn't drunk. Well, he is seen on CCTV, and you can see that on the internet still, where he's standing outside of the bar, and he takes his top off, his coat off, and then he tries to put them back on again. He looks like he's a bit out of it and disoriented, and he again is leaning over to be sick. Well, he disappeared. He was seen on one more CCTV camera, and then after that disappeared. But at the same time, a SUV was stolen from the Department of Conservation in another area of the city. When the father got involved after his son had been found, and the police had said, well, he just had an accident in the water, he said that the car was seen on CCTV passing the bar. And the vehicle that was stolen had the boy's cell phone very close to the place where the car was stolen. But I've been working with a federal agent who's been on the case for a long, long time. He's not really known in the public arena, but he does it all free because he got involved with the boy's father, and he has given me a lot of information, so much so that I know that he's met one of the killers. He went undercover. So I know who has been doing it in New York. It started 20 years ago. It's still going on, but not quite as much there. But at the same time, there was this occurrence in the Midwest. So over in Wisconsin, it was happening there as well. And it was Christy Peel that noticed this. So, for example, and one more thing. In the New York case, where he was in the bar, the federal agent who I have contact with has a CCTV of somebody injecting him. So we go over and there's a case of a boy called Chris Jenkin, and he disappeared in 2002 on Halloween. He was in downtown Minneapolis, and it was because it was Halloween, they were dressed up in fancy dress. He got thrown out of the bar because the bouncer said he was drunk. Later, that was kind of queried, and he vanished from off of the pavement. Well, private detectives were hired by the family, who determined with the use of bloodhounds that he'd actually been abducted and placed into a vehicle in a parking garage and taken away. And he was found in the river, again, a long time afterwards, and he was floating on his back. He still had the costume on, and he had slip-on shoes. So despite being in the water for something like 40 days, he was on his back, his arms were crossed, and he still had the slip-on shoes. There are so many reasons that were looked into in his particular case, and it was changed to a homicide. Well, in that area, again, I know of the group who's doing it, still doing it, and I know this because of the federal agent that I work with, and he has 35 suspects, because the potential is that there's been at least 100 to 300 deaths. And it sounds like an amazingly ridiculous conspiracy, because it's called the Smiley Face Killers. The original cops were saying that there was smiley face graffiti left at the scene of where the boys were put into the river. And in fact, I kept thinking, well, that can't be the case. It can't be. But recently, there's been a cluster in Boston. I've been sent graffiti that matches what was happening in the Midwest from somebody who sent it to me in Boston, because there's been a cluster there. So there was, in the case of Chris Jenkins, he was put in a van and he was moved around. His mother says he was mentally tortured. Well, I think I know how, but that's hard to kind of describe, because a lot of the information, I'm not doing it for dramatic purpose. I simply can't say, because it's an ongoing investigation, and I know who's got the evidence, but I can't say it. The bloodhounds not only led to the parking garage, but they also led when another boy went missing at a different college in Wisconsin called St. John's, he disappeared. He'd been with his roommates. He popped out and then he just vanished. When the tracker dogs were brought in by his father, and it took him a very long time to get permission because the college is part of a monastery as such. So the people who ran the monastery were not keen on having tracker dogs brought in, and they were defensive because there is a lot of sex abusers who are priests, but who are there on sort of rehabilitation. So you have the added ingredient of the fact that when the dogs were brought in to look for this boy, Joshua, the dogs picked up on Chris Jenkins' scent. Well, he had no reason to be there. So nobody's really sure why his scent was there, but Joshua was never found. There is the possibility that you could look into the Abbey a little bit more, because one of the people who were residing there at the time was writing on an alchemy forum about the drowning ritual called Killing of the Kings. And I kind of went down that route when I was looking into it, first of all, years ago, because I put it in the first books that I was doing, because I kept trying to get it in there because I was so passionate about it being something that should be taken more seriously. And I was really thinking this is a drowning ritual, it's alchemy, it's this is why it's being done. But it's not that simple, because having spoken with Detective Gannon, I've spoken with the professor who works with him, and I've got this federal agent who's a contact who has all of this evidence. The reason why it's not taken seriously and it's seen as a conspiracy is because it began in New York, and it's a very small group there, and they began doing it. And then when it was sort of publicized in America, particularly in the Midwest, it's not so much that there's this huge, massive group that's doing it. It's the fact that a group in the Midwest realized, from, I presume, reading all the papers about it, that this is the perfect way to kill someone. Because if you put them in the water, all of the cases that I've looked into, you've probably got 2% that have been changed to homicide. So the rest of them are, they're college boys, they're getting drunk, they're walking home on their own because they take more risks than girls, and they jump into the water. But the thing is, it's always winter. Certain dates are really important. And some of them haven't drunk. Some of them have got GHB in their bodies. Some have got prescription drugs they didn't take. So there's a lot of reasons why. Some of them, I can't say exactly what, but something to do with their clothing. Their crosses and their Celtic crosses were ripped off their necks in some cases. But I thought, because I was speaking to the professor, and it's supposed to be this global phenomenon, because he said to me, what are you doing about the Manchester cases? Have you looked into them? Well, the Manchester cases are called the Manchester Pusher. I looked into those cases because I looked into them before he contacted me, and I thought, no, it's not the same thing. Yes, the pattern is there, but actually I found 2 or 3 groups of people who had pushed people into the river and the canals there because they were mugging them, and 2 gangs went to prison for it.
Sorry, Steph, just a second. Is this Manchester, UK or America?
Yeah.
Okay, here.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So,
right.
so in the UK it's called... Yeah, well, there's been 75 drowning deaths in the canals there in Manchester. And Manchester's, in comparison, it's not huge, is it? I used to live there, actually.
Yeah.
So when I looked at those, and I spoke with the journalist who first started reporting on them, and I've contacted the coroners and got the reports and things. Some of them, I can't get them all because you have to be a family member. In the UK, it's not as easy to get hold of. But the ones I have got hold of, the pattern of a certain age group going missing, and they normally in the US are very fit, very sporty, on the swim team, they're wrestlers. But in the UK, we had from 18 up to 75. And the pattern for me, and I still could be very, very wrong, but I couldn't see that pattern there. What I did see, only from doing my own research, was if I extended the search grid by going to Leeds, Birmingham, Liverpool, York, Birmingham. If I went out, and our towns, Andy, are an hour or so's drive. For our cities, aren't they? So Birmingham to Manchester and Leeds are an hour away. In the US, you might drive for a day to get to the next city. So ours are smaller. So I thought, well, maybe I'll look at what's going on at Leeds University. So I could find all these cases where they had, again, I found probably, I don't know, 15 cases in, a day or so, which fitted the pattern, but they looked to me, and who knows what I know, but they looked to me like the boys all had the same shape, the size, and the same look about them. So they were all slender, they're all exactly the same height, and they look quite gentle. So they're not the rugby player types. So I was thinking, well, I don't believe here it's the pusher, even though the professor's telling me it is. And I do know why it could be international, because I've said to you that in Wisconsin area, Minneapolis, there is a group there and it spreads out. But there's also another group, and this is where it starts to sound ridiculous, but there is also another group. These two groups, they could very easily have the same reason for working together. But that second group, I now understand why it makes sense that it could happen internationally and be carried out. I know that now because I've been told by this federal agent, and he's provided me with the evidence. He has placed people at the scenes of some of them.
Steph, let me interrupt here a second and ask you. I understand that there's a lot you're reluctant to say right now. It's an ongoing investigation. You don't want to give too much away. These groups, because I have also heard of a couple of different things in relation to going back all the way to the 60s and 70s, involving the MK Ultra program out here. People, especially transients or homeless children being kidnapped for these programs and used for mind control experiments, psychotic drug experiments, all sorts of things. Is these groups related to something like that, or is it something completely different, like either a religious or sex cult type of thing?
Well, I did look down that avenue, and in fact somebody contacted me because I'd mentioned them, and I actually didn't realize they were still alive. They contacted me, and they had been very much the most important researcher in MK Ultra, mind control, and all of that. I was looking into that because actually there were sub-projects of MK Ultra happening at 159 universities or sub-sites of universities across America. So that was a very possible method for training somebody, recruiting them, and making them do something. Because I looked into the fact that drugs can be used on somebody and they can be made to do something and then their memory completely wiped. So that was a very possible, but I don't think it's that from what I've learnt.
Okay, well, definitely that's something that we can't wait to hear more of once you've done more research and you write more on it. And again, I can understand we can let that topic go for now because it's still an ongoing case. But before we move on, Andy, did you have any other questions on that?
A couple, really. So from what you're saying, you feel there's definitely a connection with these groups. There's though there's some differences in the modus operandi, there's a connection within them, you think?
I don't know if there is 100% connection between them, but I know what could connect them. So let's say a common interest could connect them. Because when I was told who this large group is, I just thought, no way. I was stunned, absolutely stunned. I had come across them because I've been, this phenomenon I have done more work on than anything, and I've done it for sort of 6 or 7 years. So I'd come across them and I thought, no, come on, it's just not credible. But yeah, so that one is really weird. Yes, the two groups could connect by a common interest, and not this big group necessarily, but the one I'm talking about, the more sort of regional one. That one, and again, I can't really say, but that one could have connections, let's say, with something like the Franklin Omaha type. So you've got young, boys who are abducted and even, made to do things, whether it's something like, in that case, it was, being involved with politicians for blackmail purposes and things, but they're abducted and they're put into this group and they can't really leave. So it could even be something like that that's orchestrated from higher, and they are implicated. So let's say that they've had to carry out something, one of these abductions, and once they've done it, they're kind of pretty much in it, because if they're not, they're going to be killed. And this is awful, but somebody sent me a video, and it's a compilation video on YouTube, but from one of the scenes is something, it's off the dark web. So I didn't go on the dark web. It was sent to me as a compilation, and inside this compilation is a live footage of a boy, young man, who is obviously being held. So he's on a chair, he's being held there, and on his lap is a A4 sheet of paper, and what's written on that is very much related to these cases, because everybody, it refers to it so blatantly. Now, what I don't know, of course, is whether it's a joke and it's just someone who's followed these cases and thinks it's hilarious to do that. But if it is real, then that person who's on the chair is being killed in front of you, and because they have started talking about it. So, but it could still be a joke, or it could be that it's murder, and it's because they've told somebody about it.
Well, if going 40 days missing, even in the winter time, if a body is in the water for 40 days, there's not going to be much left of that body. So the fact that they're finding bodies, arms crossed, and there's enough of the body left that hasn't been eaten by the fishes or, through natural decomposition being that long in the water, the body would be falling apart. Which makes me feel that they're not in the water for that long at all, that, they're eventually dumped in the river once they're done using them for whatever purpose.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it? Because all along I was trying to find the reason behind it all, but failing to understand until it was sort of pointed out to me with credibility that it's not so much that they're doing it because they're, how can I say it? It's more about the method of disposal. So when you try and work out, well, how can it all be going on, and then but hold on, there's different groups doing it. Well, they're doing it because, I think I said earlier, because it's the disposal method is the best way, because they don't routinely, and I spoke to several toxicologists, they don't routinely always test for GHB or things like that, and they also don't routinely do a test on the fluid in the eyeball, which cannot be corrupted. So if there was something that shouldn't be in the body, it would be detected by doing that test. But from the pathologists I've spoken to, they said they won't always do that, and especially, of course, if the police who handle the cases just think, well, they slipped in, they fell in, or because there was a case in New York a couple of years ago, and I've spoken to one of the detectives who went to the scene, and he said, well, it was suicide. But there was graffiti there that I know about that could relate to these cases. And his wallet was placed on the deck before the water, and so the cop said, well, he just jumped in, he killed himself. But they didn't... Sorry, I'm going off track. I've lost my train of thought now. But so 90% of the time the police say, well, it's just an accidental death. And I was kind of thinking about it earlier. It's almost like saying, okay, well, everybody who's killed in a car crash, it's a big conspiracy because somebody made them crash. They crashed into them from behind, and there's a gang going around doing it. So that's how ridiculous it sounds when you try and explain it. But if you were to look at some of the cases, like in Michigan, Todd Geib, he was found in a lake that had been previously searched many times, and the area around, so he wasn't there. Then he was found afterwards, and he was bobbing upright in the water. You can't drown like that, can you? You wouldn't be bobbing upright in the water. He'd been dead. He had drugs in his system that he wasn't known to take, but he wasn't killed in the water. He was killed on the land. So
Do you ever fear for your own safety, considering how much information you now have about what these groups appear to be doing, and you are obviously talking about it? Have you ever felt any threat yourself?
No, because the person who has given me the answers has the evidence and has shared it with other people who have got it. So, no, I can't put anybody away because although I've been told everything, I don't have the names and addresses.
No.
The agent does. I don't have their names and addresses.
Yeah.
I know who does, but I'm not the only one who knows who does because he's shared it with, I don't know, maybe 10 other sources. You know, he works with ex-DEAs, ex-forensic people, so he's shared it out. So I'm not really, no, it wouldn't make any difference if something happened to me because I didn't come across most of it. I was given it and it's already been shared out. So besides which, the biggest difficulty is that people are actually taking it seriously, you know.
Sure.
I mean, I think that one of them is communicating with me. And yeah, and I know of another one that's communicating with somebody else.
So have you been able to verify what he's told you outside of that particular person?
Yeah, some of it I have, yes.
Right. Okay.
But no, I'm not in danger because I don't solely, you know, I haven't been the one that's uncovered the most crucial evidence.
Still, I would be, be careful only in that because when you look at other people, let's say in other types of phenomena, like people in the UFO community who are abductees, who are routinely threatened just to shut up. Just stop telling your story because they don't want it out there in the public eye. So, it doesn't quite mean you're out of the woods there. They could still try to intimidate you to get off this subject. I mean, regardless of what the cops or the federal investigators are doing, just kind of watch your back there a little bit because people who are desperate and want to keep their illegal activities, quiet, tend to frown on when people are talking about it publicly. So,
yeah.
But you know what? If you have the book and it goes out in the book, and then, well, that's it. It's out there. Too late. For them, anyway.
As I say, I don't have that evidence myself. So
okay.
Yeah.
Well, that is just such a creepy case. It's bad enough. We're all prepared to talk about the more paranormal aspects of things, and let's just be honest. The human factor sometimes is 10 times scarier than the paranormal. It amazes me sometimes what human beings are capable of doing to each other. So incredible. Well, why don't we go ahead and move on to some of the other stories that we were going to talk about tonight that are a little bit more on the strange and unusual. What other types of stories spring to mind that you've been looking into lately?
Well, when you were saying about the homeless, I was thinking of there is a case that you might find interesting actually because of what a homeless person said about it. So I don't know if you've heard of it. It was back in 1981 when a 17-year-old boy called Kurt Sover went to a party. Now this is unrelated to what we've just been talking about, but so Kurt Sover went to a party a few blocks from his family home in Newburgh Heights, Ohio, and the party was being held at a rented apartment of a brother and sister. They were called Clayton and Debbie Sams. Well, it seemed that Kurt had been drinking that night, and probably a bit too much because his friend said, "Come outside and get some air." And then Samuel, his friend, said he went back inside the house to grab their coats, and when he came back out, Kurt had been sick. Kurt had been sick before he went in, but when he came back out, all he found was nothing, so Kurt had disappeared. Well, he looked around and couldn't find him. He searched there was a furniture warehouse and a car park and a couple of ravines and things, so he couldn't find him, so he just presumed that Kurt had gone home. But the next morning, Kurt's mother and father realised he'd been out all night, and they got hold of the girl whose party it had been, and she said that he wasn't there. But a pizza delivery boy who delivered pizzas said he clearly remembered him being there. Well, his mother and father began to plaster missing persons posters all around the neighbourhood, and up to 50 people were searching the alleys, the ravines, the local trees and bushes and looking for him, and the dumpsters and the garages. But 2 days later, a homeless man walked into a record shop in the small town there. Well, he'd been hanging around outside it for a couple of weeks, and he had said in the past to the manager of the record store, he said that he had access to bodies that were being flown in to the nearby Cleveland Hopkins International Airport, and he said he bragged about stealing the shoes from their bodies, which is really strange. Well, this day, after Kurt's gone missing, he went up to the store manager, Judy Oros, and he pointed to the missing persons poster on display in the shop, and he said to her, they're going to find him in 2 days, and they're not going to know what happened to him. Well, the following day, the girl who hosted the party, for some reason, told his family that their son had been sleeping on a cot down in the basement of their house. So his father went around with the boy's brothers, went to the basement, kicked the door in, and the father believed that it looked like somebody had been sleeping there recently, but there was no sign of his son. Then the next day, 3 local kids were cutting through the woods behind the furniture store on their way home from school, and they saw what looked like a discarded shop mannequin, half in and half out of the river, but the body is posed in a crucifixion. And according to the Cleveland newspaper, The Plain Dealer, the body was cruciform, with arms outstretched, head to one side, one knee slightly bent and one foot on top of the other. And the patrolman, Paul Grisek, I think you say, well, when he arrived, he said that the body was laid out like Christ on the cross, and one shoe was found nearby, but they never found the right shoe. So obviously it wasn't a mannequin, it was the boy's body. Eventually, the missing shoe would be found positioned in a pile of rocks, not far away. The coroner determined that he had a bruise on his cheek and bruises on his shins and minor abrasions. Well, he had no knife wounds or bullet wounds, needle marks, internal injuries, and his feet had no injuries or any marks or dirt on them. So, although he seemed to have been walking without shoes, his feet were completely clean. The coroner couldn't find a cause of death. And then, next day, the homeless man goes back into the record store and he's carrying a bunch of flowers. And he says he wants to give them to the store manager, but she hasn't got to work yet. So he hands them to the assistant and he says, here's a card with the flowers. Well, it said, roses are red, the sky is blue. They found him dead and they'll find you. Well, when the store manager arrived, she was a bit spooked by it, so she called the police. And they questioned the homeless man, but they couldn't find a reason for actually arresting him. Well, after that, he's never seen again. And then 3 days after Kurt disappeared, and prior to his body being found in the ravine, a friend of his called David Trunsnick was driving en route to a job interview. And as he was driving along in the town, he thought he spotted Kurt accompanied by a man that he didn't know. So he slowed down the car to pull over, and he didn't know that Kurt had gone missing, so he was going to offer him a ride. And then as he pulled over, he watched as a van pulled up that he hadn't seen before, and he heard Kurt shout the name Franco, and then watched as Kurt got into the van with the man who was with him. Well, a local resident also came forward, but many months later, to say that she had watched from her bedroom window 2 men dragging a teenage boy, looking like he was unconscious, toward the area that he was found in. And so she said that she hadn't come forward because she was scared, and her husband said, don't get involved. The police investigation at the time was said to have been labelled a joke, really, because one of the officers on the force was later jailed for using excessive force against people, but he wasn't related to the boy's disappearance. But the crime scene photos of Kurt in this crucifixion pose didn't seem to exist, and they don't seem to exist now. And so the theories about what happened to him, there was a drink at the time I can't remember what it's called now, but there was a really strong drink that was really popular, and people wondered if he'd had too much of it and perhaps fallen into a coma, and then they'd placed him in the basement to allow him to cool off, or that he'd overdosed. He'd drunk so much that he'd died from it, and they'd panicked and not known what to do with his body and placed him in the basement and then took him to the ravine. But the thing was, his father had been in the ravine the night before his body was found, and he said he went over that with a fine-tooth comb, and his son's body was not there. So you could say, well, actually, yes, he died at the party, they kept him down in the basement, and they must have taken him there after the father had been there. But the weird thing, I suppose, is the crucifixion pose. And
I was going to say, oh, you think?
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah,
But
yeah, I
also-
think that would be, yeah, okay, that's strange. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but also, who was the homeless man, and how did he know when the boy would be found? Maybe that was just luck. But and what was he talking about? Stealing shoes off bodies being flown into the airport. Why would bodies be flown into the airport? Dead bodies. So how did these dead bodies die, and where were the bodies coming from, if this was true? And then I actually contacted I'll remember them. An investigative journalist called Press Grey, and he runs a project called Project Astral. And he'd tried to look into this case, and I'd asked him if I could sort of use some of the information he found, because he was trying to say, actually, Wright Patterson Air Force is 3 hours away. Of course, infamous for UFOs, and maybe there's supposed to be Hangar 18 with aliens in it, but also, so Press Grey, the journalist, had discovered some cases, and then I'd looked into and find more cases of some UFO sightings in the area. So, for example, in the area where he'd gone missing and then been found, there had been triangular reports, triangular objects flying over the lake nearby, and one estimate was that it was 2 stories high, this triangular object. There was also a man was out about 11 p.m. when he witnessed, again, another triangle-shaped object, but he said it had lights on the side, and it was big enough to be 70 feet. And he said, I've never told a soul about this, but then he was recalling it after it happened, sort of 20 years later, and he said that he'd actually been at home the time it had happened, and that something had woken him up, and he'd gone to the window, and as if it had kind of called him to watch it. And he at first thought that it was a helicopter, but it didn't have that shape, and there wasn't any sound, and obviously it couldn't have been because of the size of it. But the weird thing about him was that he later went on to say that things went really strange in his life, particularly at night after that. He said, I had 5 weeks of weird things happening where I would just wake up and there was this ship. And then next thing you know, I'm outside asleep on a lawn chair. And he's thinking, how on earth did I get out there? And also the lawn chairs actually were kept in a locked area beside his swimming pool. So he had no idea how he could have got the key was in the house, but it wasn't accessible to him. So he didn't know how he kept being lured outside. And actually somebody recently contacted me about something very similar to that. And he feels that he's been lured outside, and his cousin has woken up in the early hours of the morning and seen that he's standing outside as if he's been called. But going back to this story, so then, not long after this, actually, I found another account, actually, but a former army sergeant called Mr. Todd Neese. He was in the same area, wooded area, and he began to hear really strange sounds and the trees or the bushes being sort of broken. And then he says that he saw this creature that suddenly stuck its head out of the tree line and was running along the abandoned railroad track. And in fact, he was with 2 others, and he says that they shot at it. The creature fell down, but got back immediately up, even though they knew that they'd hit it. And he described it as really odd in appearance and said it had 1 eye. And a woman in February 1981, about an hour away from that, so a little bit further away, but she had sent a report in to MUFON about seeing humanoids at the same time that a UFO was flying over a gravel pit. And there were other reports by dog owners. So there were lots of really weird sightings. But then also, not long after he had disappeared and been found, another schoolboy, so a little bit younger, but a boy called Eugene Cavett, he was found dead in a ravine very close to where Kurt's body was found. He was also missing his right shoe, and he'd been missing for roughly the same amount of time as Kurt. His death was presumed to have been falling into the ravine. But the coroner at the time said, well, of course he could have been pushed or thrown. He did have minor abrasions, but no other big injuries. So again, it wasn't really clear how he had died. But they were both found close by in ravines, missing shoes, and a weird homeless man.
And strange creatures,
obviously.
strange creatures running down the road.
Yeah, it's got it all, hasn't it?
A little bit. I'm sorry.
They're looking for shoes then, these strange creatures.
Maybe
it's a common thing, isn't it? I mean, it could be that, in Kurt's case, well, he was struggling with, or he was being dragged by these guys, according to one witness, and so of course his shoes came off, but then why was one lodged in a rock, almost like left deliberately there?
There are some predators that will lodge their kills in a rock or on a tree limb to come back for it later. That's something to consider. Really strange. We're coming on the top of the hour. We're talking with Steph Young, author of several books, including Horror in the Woods and Terror in the Woods, The Missing. And we've been talking about people going missing, both on man-made phenomenon and paranormal type of phenomenon. And that's what I'm going to start getting into some of the more stuff that you started off with in the woods and in other locations on why people are going missing through different types of phenomenon.
Can I actually jump in for a second and talk to Steph about one that we've talked about off air some time back? I know she's done some digging, and I've done a fair bit of digging into a place called Clapham Wood on the south coast of Essex, England in Sussex. Absolutely fascinating place. I know we've talked about it before. How did you first find out about Clapham? Because it's probably one of the most unusual sites over here, Mark, for this kind of disappearance phenomenon in woods. How did you first find out about it?
I came across some writing, and I think it might have been in the Fortean Times. It was looking through archives, and it was through the writings of Charles Walker, who
Good old Charles, good friend of mine.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, I know Charles well.
You know him?
Yeah, I've been into Clapham several times with Charles, so yeah.
Have you?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what can you tell us then?
No, I'm the interviewer. You're being interviewed here. I mean, you found it the same as I did. He started looking into it in the 1970s, having had reports of people apparently disappearing. I know there are some grey areas. I wonder why perhaps you might be able to feel a bit more on is the disappearance of a police officer. Now, I've heard differing reports about the identity of this policeman. Others have said, actually, if you go into police records, no one by that name was stationed anywhere near the area, i.e. was he actually a police officer or was he somebody else? I don't know what you've come across about that particular one.
I've only found in the places that I've found it written about has only been a police officer, yes. But there is a lot of muddiness about those cases because I know that there was a woman that was found, but she'd been attacked, hadn't she? So although
she was thought to be mentally ill, wasn't she? And may have been deluded at the time, but something has definitely happened to her, certainly.
So there is a lot of disparity in a way about, I suppose, what really happened to these cases and whether they are all linked by some reason. I don't really know. I mean, I've looked into them, but yeah, I don't know.
I might have thrown you off track a little bit there. I do apologise. The one that I found the most fascinating. So go on.
Yeah, not really, Andy. It's just that I I feel a little bit skeptical about them in some ways, because if you look really, really deeply, there was some kind of local character who was said to have been responsible for certain cases and things like that. So I think the more you kind of read about it, you kind of think, okay, I'm not sure. I mean, initially it did seem that dogs were going missing, weren't they? And then these bodies were found over a series of sort of months, and the vicar as well, who was found in there.
Probably the most famous verified missing person from in Clapham was the locum vicar, wasn't he? Apparently he'd gone out for a walk, literally just sort of in the summer's evening, and never returned, and was found, I think it was a couple of 2 to 3 weeks later. But they are quite certain that the area that he was actually found in had been previously searched and nothing had been found. And yet his decomposing body was found about 3 weeks after he'd gone missing. And the one that I always find the most amazing, which is, of course, the disappearing horse, which is really quite spectacular. That just briefly, come.
Sorry, Andy. Do you know what really fascinates me is the Hecate story. So you can say, all right, well, I just think it's so atmospheric. Charles Walker said that he put some notices out, didn't he, in local newspapers saying, anybody, have you had an experience, please contact me. And this person contacted him and said, I'll meet you in the woods, I'll tell you what's going on. And it was dark when he went into the woods, and he's thinking, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. And then this person this person turns up and says, don't turn around, don't look at me. And then he says, we are from the Friends of Hecate, we have friends in high places, you know, we're not ordinary here, we're from, you know, up above, and don't interfere in our business. And I tell you why as well. Recently, I kind of wonder about that even more, because I've made a very good friend called Paul Sinclair, who has written a book. I wish I'd written it, because it reminds me of my books, but I just think, oh my God, it's so good, but like better than mine, you know, where he has done so much research, but up north. And I had no idea all of this was going on. Well, I did a little bit of digging, because I had actually put on Facebook, I love this book, so if you like mine, you will devour this. And he'd found out, and so since then we've been talking, and I couldn't put it down, but there's an area up north, and it is his research, it's not mine, but an RAF base that was abandoned. We got talking because people, specifically men, have gone missing up there near this abandoned RAF base. Now, there was satanic murals painted in the underground base. And it was said that it couldn't have been done by amateurs or kids. It was pretty well done. And so Paul Sinclair was making inquiries about the possibility of there being a cult and you know, satanic practices going on under the base, and was it related to these missing men who were being found in the sea, or just not being found at all, just simply disappearing in this remote area where there's an RSPB bird sanctuary and an abandoned RAF base with bunkers underneath? Well, so he was talking to locals. I mean, he's been looking into stuff for 20 odd, 30 odd years. In the bunker, they found very well made satanic robes. Now, when I was talking to him about that, he thinks it could have been a local group, and he doesn't think that it's related to all the missing men. Although one schoolboy, a college boy, had been looking on Google about the satanic artwork under the base, and had driven up there and disappeared. Well, so that might have something to do with it. It might not. So that's what we were talking about, and I wanted to look further into the possibility of whether I could connect any of the other areas, let's say, as an example, Clapham Woods, or the Bridgend hangings, because I do wonder still whether there was some kind of occult influence in all those youngsters going into the woods in Bridgend, Wales, and hanging themselves, because it's such a high number. So, and I was also looking into ley lines. I can't, it's a bit like those other cases, but I don't want to say why I was looking into ley lines, but there is a specific group that I was interested in, a satanic group, a specific one. But I was asking somebody who had written a very good article about the ley lines and things. And I'm getting very long-winded, but I was trying to find out whether this satanic group were big or local or what in the north at this base. Well, I got hold of somebody who'd written an article about the area and ley lines, and he was giving me his sort of understanding of research many years, and he mentioned the word Hecate again. So I'm thinking, oh, no, not that he was saying it definitely is the Hecate cult, and even whether they even exist, I don't know. But then I thought, oh, so Clapham Woods. Then you've got way up in Humberside the possibility that maybe this occult group really does or did exist. So what do you think, Andy?
I would like to know a little bit more about, any more detail about the groups you're talking to. I don't know if you know my background, but I write about the occult. I have a few books out on various elements and aspects, so I might be able to provide you more information. The thing that I really would like to know is, do you have, or does Paul have images, photographs of the murals and images that were painted at this military bases? There's a pretty good chance I'm going to recognise them. Okay, for my rather large, vast collection of esoteric titles I have here. I have quite a library of such material. So I think perhaps something we should talk about more.
Yes, I think we definitely should. He does have them. And also, I believe some actually are on the internet that I could find. But he would know best. So, well, that's very interesting, Andy. Thank you.
That would be very interesting to follow that a bit further.
It would indeed.
Definitely. My personal thoughts about sort of things that the friends of Hecate or Hecate, as Charles always likes to call them, which is a mispronunciation, is Hecate, but apparently the guy called them Hecate just to show off, I think. Okay. Again, mixed feelings. Some of the stuff I've looked into myself, and I'm not too sure whether I believe it or not, but I think we can safely say something strange went on in Clapham in those times. Exactly what I think is a question of debate, but certainly something's gone on, and it continues to be used, but I think partly because, of course, what Charles had written about back in the 70s and 80s. But I was actually there a couple of months ago, I should say. Took some friends and went on a tour, and we were quite disappointed. It's been massively denuded of trees. There's two very large areas now that are completely cleared of trees. Half of it's now been fenced off and seems to be used for some kind of private estate, because you can hear pheasants, the sound of pheasants sort of making the kind of noises they would make, and those areas are now marked as private. So we'll get a feeling part of the land has also been bought. So the wood is nothing like what it used to be, unfortunately. It's very much changed, and it's probably only a third of its original size.
Oh, that's a shame, isn't it?
It really is a shame, absolutely. Certainly been...
That's very interesting, Andy. I think we'll have to talk more. You're going to be somebody I can really pick your brains on.
Yeah, sure. I'm quite happy to help if I can. What else would you say particularly has really grabbed your interest in the more very unusual experiences? I mean, the real kind of stranger ones.
Oh, okay. Do you know the story of Netta Fornario?
Not off the top of my head, but go for it.
Okay. Well, so this fascinates me because she was living in Kew in London in the early 1900s, and she was an orphan, and she was living with her grandparents, and she didn't really socialise. The only thing she loved was going to spiritualist meetings, and she joined the Alpha and Omega Temple, which was an offshoot of the Golden Dawn, and Samuel Mathers founded that.
Oh, that's something I know an awful lot about, yes.
Well, you'll love this story then. So he founded it. Was it okay, so did he found it after fighting with Aleister Crowley?
The Hermetic Order of Golden Dawn itself was founded in 1888. At that point, Crowley was just pretty much a kid still. But it was Gregor Mathers, William Westcott, and William Woodman founded it together, the three of them. Woodman died fairly soon afterwards, and McGregor Mathers and Westcott ran it together, effectively. But Westcott kind of took a bit of a step back. He was a government coroner and was actually got into a bit of trouble because of his involvement in the esoteric, and was actually basically told that you were supposed to preside over dead bodies, not to try and resurrect them, i.e. Absolutely. So he was
Oh my
told basically much, disappear into the background or you're going to lose your job. So Mathers pretty much ran it on his own for a period of time. Crowley was an early member. He quickly rose up in the ranks of the Golden Dawn, then promptly had a massive falling out with Mathers. They were best of friends, and Mathers was very much his hero. But Crowley very much fell out with him when they did part very badly, shall we say, and he went off to basically took over a group called the OTO a bit later on. But there was a period of time when he was kind of a maverick running around on his own. So I would imagine this is the time frame you're probably talking about. This is the early 1900s. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, so Netta Fornarino, she was only really interested in spiritualism and going to those kind of meetings. Well, in 1929, she decided that she was going to go to the remote island of Iona in the Hebrides, which is only 3 miles wide, and at the time had no electricity, no water, no phones. Well, she said that she was going there for some tranquility. Well, the diarist, Dr. Samuel Johnson, had described the island as a place of strange magnetic energy, but highly powerful, and a 7th century abbot called Adomnan, I think, he had written about St. Columbus and how they had fought with dragons and could control the weather, and he had angelic encounters there. So it was all very sort of mystical. But she'd gone there and she took lodgings with a family, and she seemed to be trying to commune with spirits, and her friends thought that it was probably because she was trying to contact her deceased mother. Well, she disappeared one day. Before she disappeared, she'd had a habit of staying in her bedroom in the daytime and writing in her journal, and then at night she would go out on the moors. Well, one day the mother of the family noticed that her room is empty and it didn't appear that she'd been back there. So when she still didn't come the next day, they set out across to look for her. But it was quite an open island, and they looked everywhere, but they couldn't find her. And then the next day, they found her body, and she was laid out on a little mound, and she had a long black cloak on and a sort of ritual dagger or knife in her hand, and she had nothing else on. They could only really think that she died of exposure, and she didn't have dirty feet. So although she had a death mask face that looked like she had died of terror, she had bloody toenails and toes, but the soles of her feet were completely clean. Well, they couldn't really work out how she died, but the friends of hers who were in this order came up with some opinions, one of which was that it was Samuel Mather's wife had killed Nettie on the astral plane, because the wife of Samuel Mathers was now dead, and for some reason they believed that she may have killed her on the astral plane somehow. They believed possibly that Nettie had actually been trying to contact the 7 rays on the astral plane, so the realm of the fairies. The reason that some people thought that was because she also wrote at the time for the Occult Review, and she was obsessed with an author who had written an opera, and the opera was about the fae or the fairies and how they were a very foreboding race, and that humans should not sort of take them on because the fae would win. So there was, this idea that maybe she had somehow sort of been traveling astrally and had died because she'd been trying to reach that domain, but they hadn't taken kindly to it, or she'd reached another domain, and but there's other really strange twists as well, because the author who had written this opera that she'd gone to see about 10 times and then written about in the Occult Review. He wrote as a woman, but he was actually a man, and he grew up on that island. And one day he was out, he was only a child, and he went to find his best friend, who was a girl. And when he got to her house, he couldn't see her, and he asked her mother and said, where is she? And the mother said, she's gone with the fairies. Well, she never came back. She was never found. And the place that Nettie's body was found was on this mound that was supposed to be a fairy mound. So it's just a really strange story. I mean, it's a true story. And there was reports of a hooded figure being seen by some of the locals. There was reports that the island was haunted by the monks who had a monastery there once, and they were driven off the island. There were lights seen in the sky sometimes. So there's all these different strange things, that were going on there.
The only thing I can say that might clarify things a little is I can't speak now. Mrs. Mathers, shall we say, actually outlived Samuel by about 10 years, so she wouldn't have died. She was still alive. But there's something about that story that's ringing a bell. I think I've read it somewhere. I must admit, the elements that definitely are ringing true to me. So yeah, that is really interesting. So I think I've come across at least part of that story before.
Yeah, it is. I didn't sort of create it. Yeah, it's definitely, you can find it, definitely. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah. So that I'm trying to think, actually, the opera you might be talking about as well. The Occult Review magazine itself was obviously around for a long time, and there's lots of articles in it. But it's that interesting link we get with the idea of the fairies doing strange things in the early 1900s, and now, of course, you come into our sort of time, you'd be talking more like aliens, UFO abductions, rather opposed to otherworld abductions. The same kind of phenomena being recorded in different ways throughout sort of time, particularly, as I say, back in those sort of days, to talk about fairies and underworld disappearances. That would make more sense to them, whereas to us, the idea of aliens and abductions would make more sense. It's interesting on that, but the theme's still there of these otherworldly contacts, whether they're fairies or aliens or whatever. I find that quite fascinating, those kind of connections that you seem to get with these sorts of stories.
I do as well, and I always say, well, if you were the one that had the experience and somebody was telling you it wasn't a fairy, it was an alien, or it wasn't Bigfoot, it was an alien, you would say, no, I know what I saw. So it's really hard, isn't it? Because they could both be the same thing.
Yes.
That we're seeing.
Exactly, that's what I would say also. They're neither one nor the other. They are something else. And there's something funny enough Mark and I have talked about before, that there is something else. These other things exist, but depending on what your interests, your background, your own experiences are, that's how you'll perceive them. That's how you'll see them. Us sort of people who are into ghosts will see a more ghostly phenomena. Those more into UFOs will see an alien phenomena. But we're all seeing something, almost as if that something, whatever it is, takes on a form that suits our own belief system, our own understandings. And sometimes you even get reports of a group of people seeing a phenomenon, but the people describe something different depending on who they are and what their own interests are. They see the same experience, but they remember it or recall it differently, not because of a failing of memory, but based on what they understand themselves.
And yet I also feel like, why can't they all exist as well? So I know there's the belief or theory, or that this can all be manifesting from the same place, and they're all the same, but I kind of feel like they're on different levels of existence, or in different universes that merge into ours, or that's what they are. So why can't they all exist, rather than why does it have to be that aliens are fairies but we just see them differently? So do you see what I mean? I kind of think, couldn't they all exist? Why? Because couldn't they?
My own thinking would be that they all do, because that's how we are perceiving them. They're none of them. They're not any one of those things. They are all of those things. Exactly that. So yeah, we're kind of on the same sort of wavelength. They describe it slightly differently, but essentially the same thing. That they're not individually, they're not the one thing or the other or the other. They are the something, and the end is literally as you perceive them. That is what they come across as. I mean, it's a little bit different, but there's I forget the author's name now. Ray Bradbury, his Chronicles of Mars. There was I remember seeing the TV version in which they had these kind of creatures that were the Martians.
Yeah, the Martian Chronicles, based on his. Yeah, I remember that show.
Where they would appear differently to different people. Because one bit that really caught my imagination at the time, my first saw it, was there was a scene where there's a vicar trying to set up a church on Mars, and one of the Martian creatures has come into the church, and the vicar sees him as Christ, or at least some kind of biblical figure. And the guy is saying, I'm taking on this form because that's what you want to see. That's your expectation. It's completely amorphous. I have no identity, but you see me like that, and I become what you want to see. So I am Christ standing in front of you, even though actually I'm not, but for you there's no difference. I am this figure. That's the kind of thing I always find is the most fascinating, that idea that they are what you want them to appear to be. They are, but they've taken that form from you. See what I mean? I know it's a slightly different idea to what you're saying there, Steph, but that's always been my kind of thinking on those lines. But those are just those disappearance cases and that kind of thing, as you say, where they are, it just doesn't add up. You think all these strange elements are going on at the same time. How can you put together a coherent picture of what's happened to this person with these strange things that just don't connect together?
Andy, you're slightly psychic, aren't you?
I've had my dealings, shall we say, yes.
Yeah. So I always see. I'm not. So I always wonder what you can see compared to somebody who can't see any of it. You know, so what you can see that's out there that we can't see.
Well, my specific experiences have been more to do with haunted locations, where I can get quite an accurate picture in my mind of how a place would have looked at the time. I don't tend to pick up on people and anything like that, but when I was more actively involved in investigating, that was kind of my gift, if you want to call it. I could accurately describe the inside of a location from centuries ago, and I could see it very clearly, but I knew it was my mind I was seeing. It wasn't in front of me. It's a little bit like a kind of a dream state where you know it's a lucid dreaming in effect. You know you're dreaming it, you know you're seeing it, but it's not actually in front of you, but it seems very, very real. And I've done things like tarot readings before in the past, and again with those readings you are describing a scene that you're seeing so clearly in your mind. It's like you're watching it. You know, it's like you're recalling a film you've just saw yesterday. You know, it's that clear in your mind, and it's that kind of thing that I experience.
Where's that coming from?
That is a question for a whole show, I think. For me, I am very much also based in Jungian psychology. I'm a Jungian psychotherapist. For me, it's connected with things like the collective unconscious imagery, the archetypes, all that kind of deep level of awareness, a shared transpersonal identity that we all have. We have the interconnectivity, but it's a very deep, deep level. So for me, a very shortened answer to that question is it comes from there, that level of collectiveness that we are. I mean, we can get into the science of this now, that we are talking about energy, that we are all fundamentally just energy that's very, very condensed to form matter, but matter and energy are the same thing. So if there is that interconnectivity because it's all the same energy, then the idea of the mind at the very deepest level having a connection also makes sense to me as well. And I mean, there are people who would think that way. Others have obviously very different explanations for these sorts of things, but for me, that's where it's coming from.
Did you have this from birth or develop it?
The answer to that question would be, I first noticed something very strange when I was about 9 years old. And there's a little story I often tell about my first sort of paranormal encounter, but I also have, and I've made no mistake, no mystery about it, a very strong interest in the elements of the occult and ritual magic, and I've been involved in ceremonial magic for many, many years. So that definitely develops all your skills and abilities. I mean, I have no connection with anything satanic or anything like that. Just so that in because what we were talking about earlier on, I have no links there. I know of groups, certainly. Most of the groups I know that would call themselves satanic are very benign and not harmless. And I think certain people use those terms to describe themselves to excuse what they're actually doing, which is often just basically what we call grey evil, which is just nasty, murderous violence type. That they use that as an excuse to have power over people and that kind of thing. That they use terms like satanic and those labels because they want to give a certain impression just to hide what they really are, which is just murderous, violent people sometimes, and controlling people especially. You see a lot of that sort of thing.
I think we should do a show with you, Andy, just talking, actually, because you're
I've
fascinating.
Well, I've done a few shows actually with Paranormal UK Radio myself as a guest. I actually have my own show as well. So
Oh, my goodness.
been down
Okay.
that road as well. But I think I should have to Mark. He's probably should have been left out at the moment.
Sorry, Mark. You're very interesting, Andy. Well, so you, Mark.
But I think we need to have a good conversation at some point, Steph, about the occult angle of some of the stuff you've been talking about. I can probably help you out with some more information there, definitely.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Mark, you still with us?
Mark.
I think we've lost him. So I'll tell you what, let's go back. I want to go back to the beginning. How did you first get interested in the whole idea of time travel? Because that's what you said was how it started for you.
Well, I don't know, actually. I can't remember now. You see, the thing for me is I don't know if you know of any shows apart from the one we're on now, but in the UK, we're very deprived in terms of radio shows to listen to, aren't we, that cover these topics.
Well, that's why we have the Paranormal UK Radio Network. We're trying to develop more shows based for the UK and the world to bring up all these different types of topics and have something more premier for UK audiences.
Well, you're absolutely right, Mark, because there just isn't. And so how I came to be interested in radio shows covering these topics was only when I went to Arizona and picked up Coast to Coast, because I've always been a radio listener all my life, chat shows and things, but there was nothing. So when I found that one there, I couldn't believe it. And so, yes, we need those kind of radio shows. So how I got interested in the time travel and things like that, it was because I was listening to things like Coast to Coast. I'd always been more interested. Well, I spent a lot of my time growing up on the Isle of Wight, which is, I say, the most haunted island in the world. So I grew up with that kind of folklore as a child, and I have always had a fascination with life after death and afterlife communication and that side of things. So, in fact, that's the kind of research I did first. And I was writing under a female pen name, and I wanted to write about scarier topics. So for me, in a way, sort of time travel and disappearing is much scarier than life after death and near-death experiences. So that's when I took on the persona of Stephen and started looking into those topics. I don't know how I got interested in time travel. I think I'd heard shows on Coast to Coast, things like Andrew Passaggio saying that he'd been taken up to Mars and things like that, and I just got very excited about hearing these topics because it's not something that I grew up hearing about, because we just don't have those shows here. So I think that's how it kind of all happened. I'd started writing for UK magazines over here because I have always been so passionate about these topics, and I used to buy the magazines, and I thought, but I want to write these stories, do the research and things. And so I just did it that way.
And that's what you got to do sometimes. Sometimes you just need to take the lead and write about what you're passionate about. And I commend you for that, because I know I have several things I want to start writing about, but I need to start learning how to narrow them down. So I'll have to see from there. But, you just have to do what works for you, what's passionate for you, and move from there. Now, some of these other stories, and especially the real weirder ones, you mentioned about different places around the world where things happen. And that's one of the things that I've really been trying to focus in my own research lately, is not only things, let's say, underground. You mentioned the people, the looking into the research on the Fae, the fairy lore, the Fae, underground in mines and caves, and that fascinates me. And I remember some stories that you had previously written about, where people have gone into caves or mines and had experiences of beings calling them or trying to beckon them to come in further into the mines. It's weird and kind of scary.
I'm trying to remember. Well, I think on the last show we talked about the catacombs in Malta and the entities that were beckoning a woman who'd sneaked off, gone away from the guided trail, and found herself being confronted with these 9-foot-tall entities that were beckoning her across an abyss. I think I put some cases, just some kind of stories about haunted tunnels, like when the railways were built and over in America, and they had haunted experiences. There was a case of a hunter who had gone missing and was found a couple of days later. I cannot remember the name of the railway, but it was a newly built railway back in the sort of, I don't know, 200 years ago or something like that. Well, he'd gone missing, this hunter. He had a gun with him, and when he was found 2 or 3 days later, he was babbling incoherently, and he said, and he was in a terrible state, and he said that he'd been beaten up by these entities inside the tunnel who seemed to be supernatural entities, not living creatures.
Mm-hmm. But beaten up.
Yeah, beaten. He said they took my gun off me and beat me with it.
Jeez.
Yeah, and there were 2 or 3 cases I came across like that in tunnels. A doctor had reported hearing screams, and engineers in one case had got out. A train had broken down, so one train was going into the tunnel, but another one was at the other end. So the engineer for the one that had broken down was sent back into the tunnel. He came running back out, white as a sheet, and said that there's entities in the tunnel. The other 2 workers went in with him, and they said that they could hear people saying things like they're draining our blood, but they couldn't find a source for where these people were saying these things. The railway was surrounded by no houses or anything. There were no people around. So there's a few strange stories like that. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So there's one particular case that's not necessarily about disappearance, because all the bodies were found. That I wonder. I don't think I've asked Steph about this before. Have you ever done any research into what's known as the Dyatlov Pass incident in the Ural Mountains in 1959? Have you come across that one?
I mentioned it briefly in my first book. I haven't done in-depth research into that. I found another case that happened. Gosh, I wish I could remember all of this. I can't. But I found another case that was a little bit like that, and sorry, there was no explanation as to how these climbers who had set off had ended up dead on a mountain in appalling weather, but it wasn't the weather that killed them. 2 of the group came back absolutely babbling insane, and said that the women on mules had killed their climbing partners, but they were up so high that there weren't any women on mules. They were delirious as well, but a man and woman remained on this trip up the peak of the mountain, and the woman was found dead, but she was perched into a seating position. The man was found dead, but the investigators said, well, it must have been because she liked him and he didn't like her. She wanted him to be her boyfriend, and so she killed him and threw herself off. And it just didn't make any sense what the official investigators said. So something went on up there, but it wasn't caused by those 2 people. So that's a bit similar to the Dyatlov. I haven't done in-depth work on that because I thought it kind of deserves a book to itself, doesn't it? And I didn't really have time, but I don't know about that one. Recently, I don't know what, I must have come across it somewhere. Recently, I read somebody saying, well, the reason that her tongue was cut out, or her tongue was missing, and they were in such an awful state, was because they'd been there for so long and predators have got to them, and actually that's why their bodies were in that state. Then there's the theory that it was infrasound. So I don't know really with that case. What do you think?
That's one of the ones that always fascinated me. There is a link to other things as well with that one particular. I think I may have talked about this again before. I do apologise if it wasn't with you, but some of these cases have strange anomalous lights that have been seen nearby at the time. Not necessarily sort of lights from UFOs, but strange lights. And it seems that the group themselves may have actually photographed some strange light anomalies near them around about the time of the incident itself, and they actually died. So I think there's something along those lines of the possibility of being some perhaps Russian military mystery involvement of some experimental equipment that went wrong or something along those lines. But I've always found it a abiding fascination. But it's interesting you say about the idea of the tongue. That's been what's been talked about before, that it was only when the body first thawed out that they found the tongue was missing, and without getting too gruesome, there was blood in her stomach suggesting that she was alive when it was removed. So it was unlikely to have been an animal sort of post-mortem that attacked her, and an animal that specifically targets the tongue was quite a strange one. So, but it's one of those abiding mysteries. As you say, there are several books written about it, but it is a real mystery case. But I'm quite interested about the one you were saying with the climbers. Do you remember whereabouts in the world that one happened?
I've got my book somewhere here.
Hold
on, give me 1 second. Yeah, it was John Cooper and Jeanette Johnson, and it was in South America's highest mountain, so Mount Aconcagua, Argentina, 1972.
Right. I think there's no relation to you, Mark.
Johnson? Yeah. Yeah, I know it's such a rare name. Not that many people have it, so yeah, maybe it's a distant relative for all I know.
You never know, dear. What was Steph? What would you say was the strangest case you've actually come across? What one that's really kind of sort of stuck in your mind as being, wow, that is really strange?
Probably my favourite is the I shouldn't say favourite, but the strangest one is the case of Don Kemp, who was an advertising executive in New York City, and I believe it was in 1971. He had oh, I'm sorry, no, it was in the 80s, 1984. So he was working as a New York advertising executive, and he had a sideline interest or a passion, and that was looking into the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And he actually belonged to a little research group, and he also felt that he would like to write a book about it. Well, he'd had a car accident. He was only young, in his 20s, but so it took him a long time to recover from the accident, and nobody really knows whether it was a combination of that or wanting to leave the rat race or wanting to write the book. But he decided to take off one day, so he piled his belongings into his car, and he took all his research notes, and he set off. And he ended up going to Wyoming, where he stopped en route at a small museum, and he left his briefcase there by accident, but he didn't come back for it. And then his car was found on a remote prairie, and the lights were on, the front door, the driver's door was open, belongings were trailing out of the car, he was nowhere to be seen, and it was winter. It had snowed, but it wasn't snowing that day. Well, some footprints led into the nearest field, but they seemed to just kind of stop. So when it was reported, I presume by a passerby, that the car was there but nobody was in it, the police started looking for him immediately, and they could only see this one set of footprints that stopped. They wouldn't bring the tracker dogs in, his mother said. I don't know why. But there was a barn about 6 miles away, and the searchers found 3 socks in the barn that they presumed were his, and a pile of wood. So almost as though somebody was going to make a little fire. But the tracks were not there, so it didn't lead. The tracks didn't lead to the barn. So he had disappeared. They couldn't find him. The police decided that he must have been depressed and walked off into the prairie in winter with the intention of dying. But his mother didn't believe that. And then an artist friend who lived in New York, she was out of town. And in those days, they didn't have cell phones. So when she was out of town, she'd received 2 voicemail messages that she listened to when she came back to her apartment, and she was firmly of the opinion that this was Don, her friend. And she said he sounded a bit strained, and she was sure that it was him, but he couldn't talk for long, so it was a very short message. Well, the police traced this message to a trailer in Wyoming, in a trailer park, and they interviewed the young man that lived there. Well, his sister, Don's sister, said years later that the boy could have been his doppelganger. It looked like they were identical twins. The young man said, "Look, I didn't make that phone call. You can accuse me of it, but even though it's on my phone records, it wasn't me." The police interviewed him several times, and they decided they didn't have anything to charge him with, and that they believed he was telling the truth. The young man's mother, Dawn, didn't believe it, obviously, and I think she tried to sort of, have it looked into more. Well, eventually this man moved away and got a lawyer, but the police said no, he's got nothing to do with it. Then 4 years later, Don's body is found where the car had been. Obviously the car's not there anymore because 4 years have passed. So somebody comes across his body. It's absolutely pristine, so there's no marks on it, no decomposition. And although it snowed after he had disappeared, the next day, but the searchers had already looked for him the night that he disappeared and into the next day. So it doesn't appear that his body had been frozen by a heavy snowfall and he'd been hidden, because also 4 years had passed, so the snow would have melted. He would have been seen there, but nobody ever saw him there. Well, his sister was contacted after his body was found by a doctor who was a forensic anthropologist and liaised with the FBI on cases, but he worked at the Smithsonian Institute. So he asked the sister if they would give permission for him to see the body. So the body was sent to this doctor, and he said, well, there's no injuries at all to his body, no predation, but he has a very small hole in his skull. I cannot determine how that could have possibly been made. No surgeon's tools would make that hole. And so he didn't say what he thought had caused it, but he couldn't work out anything known that would have done that. And then, kind of at the same time, the sister also said another doctor had contacted her who was investigating cattle mutilations in the area that Don had disappeared in. And in fact, a group had been camped out there. So he was contacting her saying, I think that he was taken and brought back, and it's like the mutilation cases. Well, the sister was saying, I had never heard of this before. This was in an era, she pointed out, when there were no TV shows about ghost hunters, no stories about UFOs on TV. It wasn't really as popular. There weren't Sky channels and all these satellite channels. So she said, I didn't really know anything about any of this, and I, just dismissed it all. But she said, one thing that's really strange is that Don, before he disappeared, very shortly before, he gave me a book, and it was entitled The Universe, and he turned to a page on the Pleiadians, and he said, I don't know why, but I feel that you will need to keep this book, and this is really important. And there are other twists to it as well, because just before he disappeared, he had gone with his sister to a museum which had displays about Abraham Lincoln. And when he arrived at reception, the receptionist said, oh, I've been asked to give you this card. And he looked at the card, and it was a local psychic who said she wanted to see him and hold a seance, even though he hadn't told the museum he was coming. But this psychic had known that he was going to turn up at this museum. So he contacted the psychic, and he went to the house for a seance with his sister and a friend, and the psychic's husband was there, and they all sat around the table, and Don had a camera and recording equipment. Well, the sister said, in fact, she was of the belief that it all started because they went to this seance. She said that I blame myself that we went there, and it's all happened after this. And the psychic was supposedly able to give information about pet names, nicknames, things like that were known to the family but not a stranger. And as she was doing this seance, the candles all started to flicker, and the sister said the air of evil filled the room, and in the doorway was a woman in an old-fashioned bustle. She couldn't see her face or anything, but she was just standing there and looked so menacing. And at the same time, a red line, like blood, or like the psychic's neck was being cut from side to side, appeared on the psychic's neck. And all hell broke loose because everybody was scared. And Dawn took charge and said, everybody hold hands, let's pray. And eventually everything calmed down and they left. But the sister said, I know he went back. At least 2 times he kept going back. And she said it all happened because of that. But and then the mother asked the friend of Don, after his body had been retrieved, to go and get the car back. I don't know why. It had been left in Wyoming for years, and now they had an ending to the story, so they asked him to go and collect the car and bring it back to the family home. When the car was parked in a motel, it was broken into, and a lot of the Abraham Lincoln material was stolen. Then the friend said that he then took the car back to the family home, and it was broken into again, and more stuff was taken. The mother then decided to donate some of the remaining tapes and things based on the research to, first of all, it was to a local museum in Maryland. The owner died mysteriously in a fire in his house, and everything was destroyed. And then I believe the next it was they gave the remaining items to a Civil War store owner, and he died in a strange car accident, and any remaining notes disappeared. And then the only last thing was that their friend said that ever since it happened, he sees pennies on the floor, and it's always of the year, either that Don died or that he was found. So that is a very strange case.
Absolutely. Oh, Lord. Very strange indeed. Mark, your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many strange cases similar to this where people, the ones that fascinate me are the people who go out in groups of other people, go on a hike, and one person is just like a few feet behind the other person, and then they just turn, and then they're gone. It's like they've been literally snatched out of the air when they were there seconds ago. And, there's a lot of speculation on what's causing it. Aliens or, creatures grabbing them, or the person wanders off, but yet they were literally seen seconds before, and we've discussed earlier about the ideas of these time slips or these interdimensional slips where somebody maybe just they're walking along and the conditions are right, and next thing they know, they've walked through some kind of portal or doorway that just appeared, and the next thing you know, boom, they're somewhere else. In your research, have you ever come across stories of people who have disappeared and come back with a story like that? Or is it usually they disappear and they're either gone for good or they're found dead later?
They're gone for good or found dead. The only cases where they do come back have been the fairy cases, which you could say are folklore or not, but it's only in those cases, or most of them they don't come back at all, or they're dead when they're found. Something really strange. I'm always trying to look for new angles or something that will add more to an explanation, and something so strange that I came across it because I had found this channeler who is called the next Edgar Casey, who was a very famous channeler years ago. Well, he's Canadian and he's called Dr. James Cottrell. That I'd actually come across him when I was looking into the Elisa Lam case. Cottrell had said information about what he believed was happening to Elisa Lam, and he had said, I believe that a discarnate entity was on the roof and it was projecting destructive thoughts into her head. Well, I'm not saying that's true, but that's something I was interested in what he said. Well, recently I was looking, something made me go back and see if he'd done any more work, and he had done a video on the case of the Overton Bridge, where the dogs have thrown themselves off the bridge and died in the water. in Dumbarton in Scotland. Do you know that case?
I do, certainly, yes.
Yeah. Well, do you know what he said, this channeler? He said the dogs are aware of what you might call the illumination, and they believe that they are being welcomed into this vortex. What the dogs feel are this sense of love. It's not a disorientation, but it's a call. So they are called. He said he described it as he said it was like an electrifying sexual attraction, but he also said it's like when lightning comes down to the ground and strikes, that kind of power. But he said, in his opinion, it's more to do with the actual water table under the ground and the energy of that ground and water combined. He said that they're sensing this electrifying energy and they are leaping towards it. I know it sounds insane, but he said they're mesmerized. It emanates from the ground like a darkness, but they see it as a lightness. And that this feeling to the animals is like they believe they're jumping into the arms of God. So I don't know. I mean, it's just something I'd never heard of before. It's not a supernatural thing. It's almost like you're saying it's Mother Nature herself.
Yeah, certainly what I'd heard of it was the idea they think there's some kind of strange anomalous EM field that's being generated perhaps by the water or something in the underground that's completely disorientating the dogs, and they're thinking that it's okay to go in that direction, even though they're not. They're jumping to their deaths 30 feet above a river flowing by. I'd like to know how he knows that they think the dogs believe they're going to some kind of astral light heaven, because I'm not too sure many dogs can really explain that to us, that that's what they think they're experiencing. I mean, I suppose
I know it sounds ridiculous, but I mean, he's a channeler, so if you believe in that sort of thing, and I
look at the dog's face, I suppose. You can usually tell if a dog's happy or not happy by its face, can't you, I suppose? I don't know. There's a possibility. But certainly that's the version I've heard, that they can't explain the anomalous EM field that's seems to be being caused by the water. But it's an interesting one. But the case itself is very real. I think there's another one somewhere further south where animals have been known to throw themselves off, and you have to take your dog, keep it on the lead to go over this bridge. Otherwise, it will try and scramble over the side of the bridge. But I don't think it's as high up, and I don't think they're injured. They might be sort of a bit sort of shocked by their sort of sudden drop, but I don't think any have died. I don't think it's as far down, but you're advised to keep your dog on. I'm trying to remember where it is. It's somewhere in the Midlands, but you're advised to keep your dog on a lead if you go over this particular bridge.
But so you see, that sort of thing makes me wonder about whether it could be strong enough to affect a human, because I've come across so many cases where somebody starts panicking, or it appears that they have gone to such a strange location that's really inaccessible, and you wouldn't actually want to climb in there. You've got no reason for going somewhere so difficult to climb up into. You're either being chased or something is drawing you to it. And that really fascinates me, because it's got to be a reason for it. It's not can't all be down to being confused and dehydrated, or it's got to be something that overcomes you and makes you act in the most bizarre way, other than the fact that you're confused.
I mean, I can't say an awful lot because it's about my professional work, but certainly as a therapist, you do encounter people doing the strangest things, and they'll say to you, "I have no idea why I did that. I don't know what possessed me. Suddenly I had to do the whatever." I'm not talking about criminal things. I'm talking about just strange things, that they found themselves involved in situations, and they'll almost wake up and think, how did I get myself into this mess? How did this happen?
There's a lot of, even in ufology and in cases where people have dealt with alien abductions, they talk about how they do things and react in certain ways that they normally wouldn't, like they're being manipulated or guided or even controlled. Like somebody has control of their mind and makes them do things that they never would. There's the famous case of Travis Walton back in the 70s, from the movie Fire in the Sky. He jumped out of the truck. He was the only one to jump out of the truck, and everyone's screaming at him to get back in to look at this thing. And, and there's been speculation, well, was he made to get out of the truck? You know, people do that sometimes in these types of really high strangeness situations. It's like there's an outside force planting a suggestion for them to do something they normally wouldn't do.
Absolutely. I was reminded briefly of an old friend of mine, nobody names, but one of his first experiences, UFO-like experience, was at a holiday camp. He was basically out in a chalet looking outside, and this large blue disc seemed to appear from nowhere above the chalets. And his parents and the people next door all came out and looked at it, and then they all kind of just walked back and went inside again. And he stayed outside thinking, what the hell is this? Why are you guys just walking away? And he said, I spoke to my parents and the neighbours. He was in his early teens at this point. And they said, well, there was nothing there. I don't know what you're talking about. We didn't see anything. But he said it was there, as clear as day. It was there. But he remembers it and sees it. And they came out and looked, but went back indoors after a couple of minutes. So they'd gone outside for some reason, but they said they didn't see anything. He said years later, his dad said, I wasn't supposed to talk about it. I don't know why. I just knew I wasn't supposed to talk about it. And you weren't supposed to talk about it either. And this person I'm talking about now was quite heavily involved in the UFO community. He's kind of dropped out for different reasons now, but he was involved for quite a while. And for him, it was, no, I saw it. It was there. Why are you saying it wasn't there? And their reaction was, well, no, there was nothing there. But his dad, as I said much later, we weren't supposed to talk about it. And he wouldn't tell him why he said that either. He said, I don't know. I wasn't supposed to talk about it, and nor were you. So there you go. And the way he described it, again, it wasn't kind of a classic UFO nuts and bolts. It was like a blue light, like a sphere of blue that seemed to come out from the ground or from some distance away from the ground and then sort of hover over them and then disappear. But he said, I was out there for a good 10 minutes looking at this thing thinking, what the is that? And yet his parents and the chalet next door just went back indoors again as if nothing to see. Very strange.
How strange.
Absolutely.
Somebody I was corresponding with, because he told me on a podcast, and he said, I wanted to send this in to you because it's so weird, but I don't really want to tell other people. And that's what people often say, isn't it? They don't know who to say it to, and they want to say it to somebody that's not going to laugh at them. But he when he was 18 or 19 at his parents' house, and he said that he was just watching movies in the same room as his brother, same bedroom, eating snacks, watching a movie, when he just got this urge to stand up, look out the window. It's about 1 a.m. and for no reason he's got to look out the window and look at the sky. And then he felt this beam of light sort of hit him. He woke up with some marks on his body, and then it happened again. This time he knew that he was being called to go outside. And this voice was talking to him constantly in his head. He went into his aunt's room, woke her up, she said, don't be silly. Couldn't get anybody to take any notice of him. And he's a grown man now. And he said, I went to the bathroom, I took my cat with me, I hid in the bathroom all night, I locked it, but I didn't feel safe in there because I could hear this voice and I knew that it was going to get me to get out of the house and go outside eventually. But he managed to stop himself, but it happened, he can't describe it any other way, but that he was so petrified that it was going to get so bad that he would do as it asked, and go outside. Good thing he didn't, but a relative of his did see him outside another night, and he's got no recollection of being out there, So
that's the interesting.
And a really weird thing is that over our correspondence, he works in a laboratory setting now, and he said, just talking about all these things, and he said, I don't think about it all, I don't want to carry it with me, I want a career, this is what I want to do with my life, I don't want to talk about it all, I want to forget about it, and I have done for years and years. He said, but really weird, I heard this owl hooting in my laboratory. Well, no animals are allowed in the laboratory, it's a chemical place, and certainly no owls were inside the laboratory, but this hooting noise. I know.
That's all right. I'm a big fan of the Twin Peaks TV series. I don't know if you've ever seen that. And there's a line in that about the owls are not what they seem. It's like, well, that's kind of knocking on the door. That one a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting thing, again, we're talking about light and beams of light and anomalies like that. One of the interesting, just going back to my pet areas of interest, which you did mention briefly, is the Detlef Pass explanation for that. There was two descriptions of experiences had by people who lived in the woods and experienced experiences of living in the Ural Mountains and were living in the woods and working out in the woods. One of them was a security guard who was guarding a mine. I forget the material of the mine out there. It was like something like uranium, that kind of stuff. And he was night shift guarding the mine. And on one particular evening, he recalled seeing a strange yellowy white light that absolutely scared the bejesus out of him. Now, the guy was used to working out there. He was heavily armed because he was guarding, obviously, a valuable mine site. But he just had this compulsion to get the hell away from it. It was just a light moving through the trees. It could have been like a torch, but he said it was large and too spherical to be a torch. It was a light, and it was moving towards me, and I just had to get away from it. It was terrifying me. And his story appeared in a newspaper. This is about 2001, 2002 in the Ural Mountains area. And another man who basically was a huntsman who worked a lot during the night out collecting and catching animals, obviously. So again, well used to being out in the woods at night, again armed, said he's seen a similar light phenomenon about 5 miles away on a different night, not the same night as this guy, but he's had the same reaction. He just couldn't stay near it. He was terrified of it. Even though he was heavily armed and was able to look after himself, knife, guns, etc., he had to get away from it. It was as if the light itself seemed to somehow generate this air of fear about it. And I've often wondered if perhaps the Detlef Pass guys saw this similar kind of light, and that's what scared them out of their tent to get the hell away from it, because it was just this sense, they both said the same sense of fear. They couldn't describe it or couldn't quantify the feeling, but it was definitely this light had this feeling about it that really scared the bejesus out of them. So there you go.
Yeah, I think that's really, really possible. I don't know where I was reading it, but I know somewhere up north, and I apologise, I don't know the source, but a man and his girlfriend, their car had broken down, something like on the North Yorkshire moors, somewhere like that. And their car had broken down, so of course they had no choice but to walk, and they started walking, and this light appeared, and it kept a parallel line. So as they walked, it was walking alongside them, I don't know, 20, 30 feet away, but absolutely terrified them. It was a light. Nothing else happened but this ball of light. And of course, it wasn't a torch. It wasn't anything natural, you know. And I listened to a show with somebody called Keegan. Oh gosh, he does a show about Sasquatch. Sasquatch people, I think. But he had been talking with another person, and they were running this idea that these lights can be the bearers of such creatures as Sasquatch, or whether it's a Wendigo, or whether it's actually aliens, or even spirits. This is their mode of transportation because it's plasma, and they've gone past the material state that we're in. And I don't know. So that is something that I've started looking into, these lights that, yes, terrify people. And again, the guy, Paul Sinclair from up north, who's written books similar to mine, he has an awful lot of material about having encounters with these lights, also under the sea, which is, I don't know, feels even more terrifying. But so there's something I think about these orbs.
Yes, definitely.
You know, unfortunately, we've run out of time. Time has just been flying here, and we've come to the end of the show. Stephanie, thank you so much for coming on tonight. I mean, obviously, we could have kept going and going on this, so there's so much to talk about. Real quick, how can people get a hold of you and find your books?
I have a website called StephYoungAuthor.com, or my podcast is Masquerade Podcast on iTunes, or the books are on Amazon. And thank you so much for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege.
Well, we're going to definitely have to bring you back here soon, so because there's always so much to talk about. So thank you again for coming on. Andy, thank you for joining us tonight. Irene will be back next week. Thank you to all of our listeners for listening to another edition of Paranormal UK Radio here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. We'll catch you all next week. Have a good evening.